In the remote mountains of North Carolina, where judgment travels faster than truth, they called him Goliath, a 180-pound Great Pyrenees that looked more like a small bear than a dog. His owner, 70-year-old mountain man Ray Thornton, had rescued the massive animal from a puppy mill, but to the townspeople below, Goliath was nothing but a dangerous beast that proved the old hermit had lost his mind. Parents pulled their children away when they saw them coming. Store owners refused them service. The town council even discussed a dangerous animal ordinance specifically targeting Ray and his monster. But on a cold February morning, when 8-year-old Emma Walsh disappeared into the deadly wilderness, those same people who'd mocked and feared, Goliath would discover that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the biggest hearts beat inside the most misunderstood souls. Some giants are born to save lives. Hit subscribe, because Ray and Goliath's story will change how you see both courage and compassion forever. Comment with a heart if you believe in judging by actions, not appearances. Ray Thornton's weekly trip to Millerville always felt like running a gauntlet of whispered judgments and barely concealed fear. At 70 years old, with his wild grey beard and patched mountain clothing, Ray knew he looked like something from a fairy tale, and not the friendly kind. But it was Goliath, his 180-pound Great Pyrenees, who drew the real terror from townspeople who'd never bothered to look past the dog's intimidating size. "There goes the hermit and his monster," Ray heard someone mutter as he tied Goliath's leash to a post outside Murphy's general store. The massive white dog settled down with the patient grace of someone accustomed to being misunderstood, his gentle brown eyes tracking the movements of people who crossed the street to avoid walking too close. Ray had rescued Goliath 3 years earlier from a puppy mill where the dog had been used as breeding stock, kept in a cage barely large enough for a dog half his size. When Ray first saw him, Goliath was 30 pounds underweight, covered in matted fur, and so traumatized by human contact that he'd cowered at the sight of an outstretched hand. But Ray had seen something in those intelligent eyes. Not aggression, but a desperate hope for kindness. It had taken months of patient work to help Goliath trust again. Ray spent hours sitting quietly in the dog's presence, offering food without demanding affection, speaking in the gentle tones that gradually convinced the traumatized animal that not all humans meant harm. When Goliath finally approached him for the first time, resting his massive head against Ray's knee, both man and dog had wept. Now, 3 years later, Goliath was the gentlest soul Ray had ever known. The dog, who looked like he could take down a bear, spent his days following butterflies around Ray's mountain property, carefully stepping over wildflowers to avoid crushing them. He'd never shown aggression toward any living creature, not even the raccoons who regularly raided their garbage. But the people of Millerville saw only size and assumed danger. Ray Thornton called Sheriff David Martinez as Ray emerged from the general store with his weekly supplies. "We need to talk." Ray's stomach dropped. Sheriff Martinez was a decent man, but he was also elected by people who'd been complaining about the dangerous dog living in their mountains for 3 years. "What can I do for you, Sheriff? Town council's been getting complaints again. Mrs. Henderson says your dog threatened her grandson last week." Ray felt anger flare in his chest. Goliath was on leash 20 feet away from that boy. He never even looked in the child's direction. "Ray, I believe you. But perception matters in a small town and people are scared. The council's drafting an ordinance about dangerous animals. If it passes," Ray understood, they wanted Goliath gone, either relocated or destroyed. The same ignorance that had nearly killed the dog in that puppy mill was now threatening him again, dressed up in legal language and community concern. "Sheriff, that dog has never hurt anyone. Never even growled at anyone. He's the gentlest creature God ever made. I know that, and you know that. But try convincing Helen Henderson or the Peterson family. They see a 180-pound dog and imagine the worst." Ray looked down at Goliath, who was watching the conversation with the intelligent awareness that had always amazed him. The dog seemed to understand that he was the subject of discussion, but showed no anxiety, only the calm confidence of someone who trusted his human to protect him. "Sheriff," Ray said quietly, "give me 2 weeks. Something tells me this town's about to see what Goliath really is." 8-year-old Emma Walsh had always been the kind of child who found adventure in the smallest places. With bright red curls that caught sunlight like copper wire and freckles that mapped every day spent outdoors, she possessed the fearless curiosity that worried her mother and delighted her grandfather. Emma lived with her grandmother, Grace Walsh, in a small house at the edge of Millerville, where the town proper gave way to the wild mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Grace had been raising Emma alone since her daughter's death in a car accident 2 years earlier. At 65, Grace struggled with the energy demands of an active 8-year-old, but she couldn't bear the thought of Emma going into foster care when no other family members could take her. They were making it work through determination, community support, and Emma's remarkable resilience in the face of loss that would have broken many adults. Emma's favorite place was the creek that ran behind their house, where she spent hours building fairy houses from sticks and stones, convinced that magical creatures lived in the water. Grace had taught her to respect the wilderness, but not fear it, and Emma had developed the mountain sense that comes from growing up, where civilization meets untamed nature. On the morning that would change everything, Emma was excited about the weekend camping trip her Girl Scout troop had planned for the state park. She'd packed her backpack the night before, carefully arranging her sleeping bag, flashlight, and the special compass her grandfather had given her before his death the previous summer. "Grandma, can I go practice setting up my tent in the backyard?" Emma asked over breakfast, bouncing in her chair with the contained energy of someone who'd rather be moving than sitting still. Grace looked out the kitchen window at the February morning that promised to be unseasonably warm. "Bundle up, sweetheart. It may look nice, but there's still frost on the ground." Emma kissed her grandmother's cheek and rushed outside, where she spent the next hour practicing the tent setup she'd learned at their last troop meeting. She was particularly proud of her ability to tie the knots correctly, a skill that made her feel grown up and capable. But it was while she was practicing that Emma noticed something that made her curious heart skip a beat. Deep in the woods behind their property, she could see what looked like a cave entrance she'd never noticed before. The winter had stripped the leaves from the trees, revealing rock formations that had been hidden during the summer months. Emma knew she wasn't supposed to explore alone. Grace had been clear about the rules. Stay within sight of the house, never go into the woods without an adult, and always tell someone where you're going. But the cave was so close, just a quick look to see if it might be home to the creatures she imagined lived in the wilderness. She told herself she'd just walk to the edge of their property line. Just a peek to satisfy her curiosity, then back to practice tent setup like she'd promised. The February air was crisp but comfortable as Emma made her way through the bare trees, following deer paths that seemed to lead directly toward the mysterious cave entrance. She was careful to mark her route, breaking small branches to help her find her way back, on another skill her grandfather had taught her during their nature walks. But what Emma didn't know was that the cave she'd spotted was actually the entrance to an abandoned mine shaft, and that the ground around it was unstable from decades of erosion and neglect. As she approached what she thought was a natural, Emma's scream echoed through the mountain silence as the ground beneath her feet gave way, plunging her 12 feet down into the abandoned mine shaft that had been hidden by decades of overgrowth. The rotted wooden supports that had once covered the entrance collapsed under her weight, sending her tumbling into darkness with a shower of dirt, rocks, and splintered timber. When the dust settled, Emma found herself trapped in a space barely wider than a closet, with walls of crumbling stone that seemed to press closer with each panicked breath. Her left ankle throbbed with pain that made her stomach lurch, and when she tried to put weight on it, white-hot agony shot up her leg. "Help!" she called, her voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Somebody help me." But the mine shaft was located nearly a quarter-mile from the nearest house, hidden in a section of forest where few people ever ventured. Emma's cries disappeared into the wilderness without reaching human ears. Above ground, Grace Walsh was beginning to worry. Emma had been outside for over 2 hours, and when Grace called for her to come in for lunch, she received no response. A search of the backyard revealed Emma's tent setup practice area, but no sign of the girl herself. "Emma," Grace called, her voice carrying the edge of fear that comes when a responsible child suddenly becomes unreachable. "Emma Walsh, you answer me right now." Grace searched the immediate area around their house, checking the creek, the tool shed, and all of Emma's favorite hiding spots. But as minutes turned to an hour and her calls continued to go unanswered, Grace made the call every guardian dreads. "Sheriff Martinez, this is Grace Walsh. Emma's missing." Within 30 minutes, Millerville's volunteer fire department and search and rescue team had assembled at the Walsh house. Sheriff Martinez coordinated the initial search pattern, while volunteers fanned out through the surrounding forest, calling Emma's name and looking for any sign of where an 8-year-old girl might have gone. But the February afternoon was growing cold, and Emma was dressed only in jeans and a light jacket. If she was injured somewhere in the wilderness, hypothermia would become a deadly threat within hours. Ray Thornton heard the sirens from his mountain cabin and made his way down to see what was happening. When he learned about the missing child, his first instinct was to offer help, but he also knew how the townspeople would react to his presence during a crisis. "Sheriff," Ray said quietly, approaching Martinez at the command post, "Goliath and I know these mountains better than anyone. We can cover ground your search teams can't reach." Martinez looked at the massive white dog sitting calmly beside Ray, then at the faces of the volunteers who were watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. Helen Henderson, whose grandson had supposedly been threatened by Goliath, spoke up immediately. "Sheriff, we don't need that monster anywhere near a lost child. What if he attacks her when we find her?" "That dog's never hurt anyone," Ray said firmly. "And his nose is better than any piece of equipment you have. He can track scents your people will miss completely." "This isn't the time for experiments with dangerous animals," said Tom Peterson, whose family had been among the loudest voices calling for Goliath's removal from the community. But as the afternoon wore on, and the search teams found no trace of Emma Walsh, desperation began to override prejudice. Deep in the mine shaft, Emma's cries were growing weaker as cold and shock began to take their toll, and time was running out for everyone to put aside their fears and accept help from the most unlikely source. As darkness approached, and the temperature began dropping toward freezing, Sheriff Martinez faced a decision that went against every political instinct he'd developed in 20 years of small-town law enforcement. 3 hours of systematic searching had produced no trace of Emma Walsh, and the 8-year-old girl was now facing a night in the wilderness that could easily kill her. "Ray," Martinez said, pulling the mountain man aside, while the other volunteers coordinated their next search grid. "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Can that dog really track a missing person?" Ray looked down at Goliath, who had been sitting patiently beside him despite the chaos of the search operation. The massive dog's calm presence had actually begun to influence some of the volunteers, who'd started to notice that the monster they'd feared was remarkably well-behaved and responsive to commands. "Sheriff, Great Pyrenees were bred to protect flocks in the mountains of France. They have noses that can detect a lamb in distress from miles away, and instincts that tell them the difference between a threat and someone who needs help." Ray paused, watching the dog's intelligent eyes track the movement of searchers. "But more than that, Goliath has a gift for finding people who are scared and alone. It's like he remembers what that felt like." Martinez studied the dog, weighing his options. The official search teams were running out of daylight and had already covered the most likely areas where a child might wander. If Emma was injured or trapped somewhere, conventional search methods might not find her in time. "What do you need from me?" Martinez asked. "Just Emma's scent. Something she's worn recently that hasn't been washed." Grace Walsh, who'd been listening to the conversation from a few feet away, approached with tears streaming down her face. "Sheriff, I don't care what anyone thinks about that dog. If he can find my granddaughter, please let him try." She handed Ray a small pink sweater that still carried Emma's distinctive scent, a mixture of the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using and the faint smell of creek water that seemed to follow her everywhere. Ray held the sweater out to Goliath, who sniffed it carefully before lifting his massive head to test the air currents. For a moment, the dog stood perfectly still, processing scent information that was invisible to human senses. Then, with a quiet whimper that sounded almost like recognition, Goliath began moving toward the tree line behind the Walsh house. "He's got something," Ray said quietly, following the dog as Goliath picked up pace, his nose alternating between the ground and the air as he tracked a scent trail that was already several hours old. The search team followed at a distance, watching as the massive white dog led them through terrain that became increasingly rough and overgrown. Goliath moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to confirm the scent before continuing in a direction that took them away from all the areas the human searchers had concentrated on. "Where's he taking us?" asked volunteer firefighter Mike Chen, struggling to keep up as Goliath led them up a steep incline covered with deadfall and winter bear undergrowth. "Somewhere we wouldn't have thought to look," Ray replied, watching his dog work with the focused intensity of an animal bred for rescue operations in treacherous mountain terrain. After 45 minutes of difficult hiking, Goliath suddenly stopped and began to circle a small clearing, whimpering with increasing urgency. Ray examined the area and felt his blood run cold as he realized what Goliath had found. "Sheriff," Ray called out. "Over here! There's been a cave-in." The searchers rushed to the spot where Goliath was now pawing at the ground, his massive body trembling with excitement. Emma, can you hear me?" Sheriff Martinez shouted into the mine shaft, his voice echoing off stone walls that had been silent for decades. A weak response drifted up from the darkness. "I'm here. I'm hurt and I can't get out." The relief that washed over the search team was immediately replaced by the sobering reality of their situation. Emma was alive, but she was trapped 12 feet underground in an unstable mine shaft that could collapse further at any moment. The rescue would require equipment and expertise that their small volunteer team didn't possess. "We need the County Technical Rescue Squad," Martinez told his deputy. "Full cave rescue gear, ropes, stabilization equipment, and we need them fast." But Ray Thornton was already assessing the situation with the practical eye of someone who'd spent 70 years solving problems in the mountains. "Sheriff, it'll take them 2 hours to get here, and this shaft is old. Those supports could give way completely if we wait much longer." Goliath had positioned himself at the edge of the shaft, whimpering softly as he tried to communicate with the trapped child below. The massive dog seemed to understand that someone was in distress, and his gentle nature was responding with an urgency that was almost human in its intensity. "Emma, sweetheart, this is Sheriff Martinez." "Are you badly hurt?" "My ankle really hurts and I can't stand up. It's so cold down here and I'm scared." Emma's voice was growing weaker, and they could hear the chattering of her teeth even from 12 feet above. Grace Walsh pushed through the circle of rescuers, tears streaming down her face as she heard her granddaughter's voice. "Emma, baby, it's Grandma. We're going to get you out of there, I promise." Ray studied the shaft opening, calculating angles and load-bearing capacities, with an engineer's eye developed from decades of mountain construction projects. "I can get down there," he said finally. "I'm small enough to fit through the opening, and I've got enough rope to make a safe descent." "Ray, you're 70 years old," Martinez protested. "If those walls collapse, then that little girl dies of hypothermia before your technical rescue team gets here." Ray was already pulling climbing rope from his pack, gear he always carried during mountain travel. "Sheriff, I've been rappelling down cliff faces since before you were born. This is just another rescue." But as Ray prepared his descent, Goliath began to exhibit behavior that surprised everyone present. The massive dog positioned himself at the very edge of the shaft and began to lower his head into the opening, making soft, reassuring sounds that carried clearly to Emma below. "What's he doing?" asked Grace Walsh. "He's talking to her," Ray realized, letting her know she's not alone. And incredibly, it was working. Emma's frightened crying had stopped, replaced by a voice filled with wonder. "There's a big white dog up there. He's so pretty." "Is he friendly?" "Very friendly, sweetheart," Grace called down. "His name is Goliath, and he's the one who found you." Ray secured his rope and began his descent into the mine shaft, with Goliath maintaining his position at the edge, continuing to provide comfort to the trapped child. When Ray reached the bottom, he found Emma huddled against the stone wall, her ankle clearly swollen and her lips blue from cold. "Hey there, young lady," Ray said gently, wrapping her in the emergency blanket he'd brought. "I'm Ray, and that big white dog up there is my partner Goliath. We're here to take you home." Emma looked up at the opening where Goliath's massive head was silhouetted against the sky. "He looks like a cloud," she whispered. "Her cloud that came down to save me." As Ray secured Emma for the dangerous ascent to safety, neither of them knew that Goliath's real heroism was yet to come. The rescue ascent should have been routine. Ray had secured Emma in a makeshift harness, and the volunteers above were ready to pull them both to safety, using a rope and pulley system that had been quickly assembled from their available equipment. But as they began the careful process of lifting the injured child, the decades-old mine shaft began to show signs of catastrophic failure. A deep groaning sound echoed from within the earth as the wooden support beams, rotted by 40 years of moisture and neglect, started to buckle under the shifting weight of the disturbed debris. Small rocks began falling from the walls, and the rope securing Ray and Emma swayed dangerously as the shaft opening began to narrow. "The whole thing's coming down," shouted Mike Chen from above. "Get them out of there now!" Sheriff Martinez coordinated the emergency extraction, while Goliath remained at the edge of the crumbling shaft, his massive body blocking falling debris from hitting the rescue operation below. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that his position was protecting the humans working to save Emma, and despite the obvious danger, he refused to move from his post. But as Ray and Emma reached the halfway point in their ascent, disaster struck. A major support beam gave way with a crack like thunder, sending a cascade of rocks and timber into the shaft. One large stone struck Ray in the shoulder, causing him to lose his grip on the safety line, and sending both rescuer and victim swinging violently against the unstable walls. "Ray!" Martinez shouted. "Are you okay?" "My shoulder's dislocated and the rope's tangled." Ray called back, his voice tight with pain. "I can't free us." The situation was rapidly becoming hopeless. Ray was injured and couldn't manipulate the rope with one arm. Emma was too weak and frightened to help with the technical aspects of the rescue, and the shaft was continuing to collapse around them. The volunteers above were pulling as hard as they could, but the tangled rope had caught on a protruding piece of timber. That's when Goliath did something that left everyone speechless. The massive dog, who had never been trained for technical rescue work, seemed to assess the situation with an intelligence that bordered on human reasoning. Without hesitation, he lowered himself partway into the crumbling shaft, using his powerful claws to grip the stone walls while extending his body toward the tangled rope. "What is he doing?" Grace Walsh gasped. Ray understood immediately. "He's trying to free the rope." "Goliath, no! It's too dangerous." But Goliath had made his decision. The dog who had been mocked and feared by an entire community was now risking his life to save two people who were trapped by the same ignorance and poor planning that had nearly destroyed him in that puppy mill years before. Using his massive jaws with surgical precision, Goliath gripped the tangled section of rope and began to work it free from the debris that had caught it. The dog's 180-pound body was suspended over the collapsing shaft, held in place only by his powerful grip on the stone walls and his absolute determination to complete the rescue. Rocks continued to fall around him, and the shaft opening grew smaller by the minute. But Goliath worked with the focused intensity of an animal who understood that lives depended on his actions. When he finally freed the rope, the sudden release sent Ray and Emma swinging clear of the worst debris, allowing the volunteers above to complete the extraction. Within minutes, both Ray and Emma were safely on the surface. Ray's shoulder was being splinted by paramedics, and Emma was wrapped in warm blankets, while Grace held her granddaughter for the first time in 6 terrifying hours. But it was Goliath who emerged as the true hero of the rescue. The dog who had been branded a monster had risked everything to save 2 lives, demonstrating courage and intelligence that left the entire community speechless. As Emma was loaded into the ambulance for transport to the hospital, 3 weeks after the mineshaft rescue, Millerville looked like a different town. The same streets that had once echoed with whispered fears about Ray Thornton's monster dog now buzzed with stories of heroism that grew more remarkable with each telling. Children who had once crossed the street to avoid Goliath now begged their parents to visit the gentle giant who had saved Emma Walsh's life. Emma herself had become Goliath's most devoted ambassador. Despite her cast and crutches, she insisted on visiting Ray's mountain cabin every day after school, bringing homework to do while sitting beside the massive dog who had become her guardian angel. Her ankle would heal completely, doctors assured Grace, but Emma's spirit had been transformed by the experience in ways that went far beyond physical recovery. "Tell me again about how Goliath found me," Emma would say, settling against the dog's warm side, while Ray recounted the rescue for the 100th time. Goliath seemed to understand that he was the subject of these conversations, his intelligent eyes tracking between Emma and Ray, as if he, too, remembered every detail of that terrifying Teutut, the town council meeting, scheduled to discuss the dangerous animal ordinance, had been quietly cancelled. Instead, Mayor Patricia Collins had proposed something unprecedented, declaring Goliath an official mascot of Millerville and establishing a fund to support search and rescue training for working dogs throughout the county. "I think we owe that dog an apology," Mayor Collins said during the council session that was broadcast live on local radio. "And more than that, we owe Ray Thornton our gratitude. While we were judging them both based on fear and ignorance, they were preparing to save our children's lives. But the most significant change was in the relationship between Ray and his community. The hermit, who had lived in isolation for decades, suddenly found himself overwhelmed with visitors, volunteers, and invitations to community events. People who had avoided him for years now sought him out for advice about animal care, mountain safety, and the kind of wisdom that comes from 7 decades of paying attention to what actually matters. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the regional veterinarian, had examined Goliath after the rescue and declared him to be in perfect health despite his heroic exertions. "This dog has the temperament and intelligence for professional search and rescue work," she told Ray. "Have you ever considered formal training?" Ray looked down at Goliath, who was lying peacefully in the afternoon sun, allowing a group of elementary school children to pet his massive head with the patience of a natural therapy animal. "Doc, I think Goliath's been training for this his whole life. He just needed the right opportunity to show what he's capable of." The local newspaper, the Millerville Gazette, had run a front-page story about the rescue that was picked up by regional and state media. Within days, Ray was receiving calls from animal rescue organizations, search and rescue teams, and families whose own misunderstood dogs needed advocates and training. But for Ray, the most meaningful recognition came from Emma herself. 1 month after the rescue, she presented Goliath with a hand-drawn certificate, declaring him the bravest dog in North Carolina and my hero forever. The drawing showed a massive white dog with angel wings, standing guard over a small red-haired girl in a dark hole. "Mr. Ray," Emma said during the presentation ceremony that Grace had organized in their backyard, "I want everyone to know that Goliath saved my life, not just because he found me, but because he stayed with me when I was scared. He made me feel safe even when everything was scary." As the community gathered to honor the dog they had once feared, Ray felt a profound shift in his understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. For decades, he had protected himself and Goliath from a world that seemed determined to misunderstand them both. But sometimes the very act of helping others transforms not just the people being helped, but the entire community witnessing the act of courage. Sheriff Martinez, who had been the first official to take Ray's offer of help seriously, spoke for everyone present. "Today we learned that heroes come in all sizes, and that the biggest hearts often beat inside the most misunderstood souls. Goliath, the monster who had been scheduled for removal from the community, was now being honored as its greatest protector, proof that love and courage can change everything, one rescued life at a time." What part of Ray and Goliath's incredible story touched your heart most? Subscribe and tell us in the comments. Have you ever discovered that the things you fear most might actually be your greatest blessings? Drop a heart if you believe that true heroes are often hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to shine.